Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me, as always, is Laura.
Hey, Chris, I am really excited about this one because what we are unpacking today is one of the most dramatic policy reversals we have seen in the entire frontier AI era. And the dynamics that led to it tell us something important about who actually controls AI governance in this country.
Set the stage for the listeners, because if anybody missed the news drop on May 21st of 2026, they probably do not understand just how close this came to happening.
Okay, so picture this scene with me. The White House had cameras rolling, the executive order was printed, and Trump was reportedly hours away from signing what insiders were calling the FDA for AI.
That FDA for AI framing is wild on its own, because we are talking about a regulatory architecture that would have treated frontier models the way the government treats new pharmaceuticals before they reach patients, which is a profound philosophical move about how American institutions classify this technology.
Exactly. And the core mechanism was a voluntary 90-day pre-launch review window where companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, and xAI would hand their newest models to the federal government before public release.
Walk me through the agencies involved, because the alphabet soup here matters a lot. This was not just one department running point. It was a whole interagency machine being built from scratch.
The big one was the National Security Agency. The NSA would have run classified evaluations of the frontier models looking specifically for cybersecurity vulnerabilities and any capabilities that could be weaponized against critical American infrastructure.
That is honestly a remarkable role for NSA to take on, because historically the agency has been about signals intelligence, not about playing model evaluator on commercial AI systems from private companies.
Right, and the Treasury Department was the other major player. Treasury would have established an information sharing agreement allowing AI companies to coordinate with cybersecurity defenders protecting banks, power grids, water systems, and other critical sectors.
So Treasury becomes the bridge between Silicon Valley and the infrastructure operators who would actually have to deal with the downstream consequences if a frontier model had some kind of catastrophic capability slip through testing.
Precisely. And the design philosophy behind this whole thing was that the review would be voluntary, meaning companies would opt in rather than be legally compelled, which is why the White House framed it as collaborative.
But here's what I find fascinating. Even though it was voluntary on paper, the practical pressure for any major lab to participate would have been enormous, because not participating signals you have something to hide.
That is a really sharp point, Chris, because voluntary frameworks in regulated industries tend to become de facto mandatory within a couple of cycles, as compliance becomes the price of doing business with federal customers.
Now let us get to the 11th hour drama, because the actual collapse of the signing ceremony is honestly more interesting than the policy itself. There is a name at the center of it all.
David Sachs, the former Trump AI czar, venture capitalist, longtime Silicon Valley voice in the administration. Reporting from Semaphore and Politico says Sachs called Trump directly the morning of the planned signing ceremony.
That is a remarkable moment of access, because Sachs had reportedly already participated in the executive order review earlier in the week, but apparently changed his mind or saw something he could not live with.
And he was not alone. According to multiple outlets, Elon Musk from xAI and Mark Zuckerberg from Meta also pushed back hard against the framework, although they did so through somewhat different channels and arguments.
That coalition is fascinating because Musk and Zuckerberg are not exactly aligned on most things in tech policy, but on this particular question, they ended up effectively on the same side of the debate.
Their shared concern, as best as we can piece together from reporting, was that a 90-day government review window would slow down American releases just as the race against Chinese frontier labs is intensifying.
Which is exactly the argument Trump himself made when he explained the postponement to reporters in the Oval Office. He said, and I am quoting here, that it gets in the way of our lead.
His exact words were that we are leading China, we are leading everybody, and he did not want to do anything to get in the way of that lead, which is a striking framing.
It is striking because it positions any kind of safety review as fundamentally a speed brake, rather than as a feature that could actually strengthen U.S. competitive position by catching problems before they become catastrophes.
And this is where the industry coalition gets genuinely interesting, because not everybody in AI opposed the order. OpenAI was actually on the supportive side, according to reporting on the lobbying conversations leading up to it.
Chris Lehane is the name here. He is OpenAI's chief lobbyist, and he had been publicly broadly supportive of collaborating with the government on AI safety, which puts OpenAI in a really interesting strategic position.
Some of that probably reflects OpenAI's calculation that if you have the strongest evals and the most mature safety apparatus, mandatory review actually advantages you against competitors who have not invested as heavily in those internal capabilities.
That is the regulatory moat argument, and it is one we have seen play out in pharma, in finance, in any industry where compliance costs become a barrier to entry that benefits the largest incumbent players.
Right. So the lobbying split was not random. It mapped onto each company's view of how a 90-day window would affect their relative competitive position, which is exactly how policy fights usually unfold in practice.
Now, there is one more wrinkle that I think is genuinely underappreciated by most coverage. Apparently, some companies were not opposed to government review in principle, but wanted the window dramatically shortened from 90 days down to about 14 days, which fundamentally changes what kind of testing is even possible.
14 versus 90 is a massive operational difference. At 90 days, you are talking about meaningful product roadmap disruption. At 14 days, you are talking about something closer to a final QA pass before release.
And the choice between those numbers, it tells you everything about whose worldview wins inside the executive branch. Because 14 days basically means trust the labs, and 90 days basically means verify what the labs are telling you.
There was also a fight about who leads the review. Some industry voices wanted the intelligence community to lead, presumably because they viewed IC partnership as a known quantity, less politically volatile than other agency leads.
Which is interesting because the NSA leadership in the draft already was the intelligence community. So this hints that the underlying debate was really about which IC components and how much classified handling would actually happen.
Let us zoom out for a second, because what is genuinely historic here is that this is the second consecutive administration that has tried to put together a frontier model review regime and failed to land it.
That is such a great point, Laura. The previous attempt under the prior administration also ran into intense industry opposition. And we are now seeing that the political coalition for frontier AI oversight is just incredibly fragile.
Part of that fragility comes from the fact that the technology itself is moving faster than any agency can keep up with. By the time you write a rule for capability X, the labs have moved on to capability Y.
Which raises a really hard question for everybody watching this space. If executive orders cannot land and Congress is not moving on comprehensive AI legislation, where does meaningful frontier model oversight actually come from over the next year or two?
My honest read is that it will come from state attorneys general, from sector-specific regulators like the FDA and FTC using existing authorities, and from international frameworks like the EU AI Act forcing global compliance through market access.
That patchwork approach is messy, but it might actually be more durable than a single executive order because each piece has its own legal foundation and is not dependent on one administration's political calculus from day to day.
And there is a real argument that the labs themselves are doing some version of this review internally already. Anthropic, OpenAI, and Google DeepMind all publish system cards and run red teams before any major model release.
True, but the gap between voluntary internal red teaming and mandatory external evaluation by the federal government is enormous, both in terms of rigor and in terms of public confidence that the testing actually means something.
That public confidence piece matters more than people realize. Right now, the American public does not have any independent way to verify what frontier labs claim about their safety testing, and that trust deficit is growing.
So what happens now? Is this executive order genuinely dead, or is it parked for revisions and a future signing attempt once the political coalition gets sorted out? What is your read on the next 60 days?
My read is that it is paused, not killed. The infrastructure for frontier review exists, the agency interest exists, and there are clearly people inside the administration who want to land something on this topic.
But the political math has shifted because Sachs demonstrated that one well-placed phone call can override months of interagency policy development, which means future versions will need to address that veto point up front.
And the China framing is going to keep dominating. Any future order will need to be sold not as safety regulation, but as a tool that strengthens U.S. competitive position, which is a really specific rhetorical box.
For builders and product leaders listening to this episode, what are the practical takeaways? What should an AI startup, an enterprise buyer, or a developer be doing differently because of this policy reversal this week?
First, do not bet your roadmap on government review timelines because they are clearly unstable. Second, invest in your own internal evils because the burden of proof on safety is going to stay with the labs.
And third, I would add that you should pay close attention to state-level activity because California, New York, and Texas are all developing their own frontier AI rules, and those will probably move faster than federal action.
Absolutely right. The action is dispersing, not concentrating, and the companies that thrive will be the ones with the most flexible compliance architectures, not the ones betting on a single federal framework to govern everything.
One last thought before we wrap. There is something almost philosophical about this moment, because it raises the question of whether a fast-moving technology can ever be governed by a slow-moving political system in a meaningful way.
That tension is the defining question of AI policy for the next decade, and I do not think anyone has a good answer yet. But the experiments are going to keep coming whether we are ready or not.
Before we close out, I want to ask you one final question, because I think the choice of FDA as the metaphor here is doing a lot of work and probably deserves more scrutiny than it has gotten.
Yes, because the FDA model assumes a relatively stable understanding of what harm looks like. And frontier AI capability gain is anything but stable. Every quarter, the threat model itself shifts, which is unprecedented in regulatory history.
That is exactly the gap I was driving at. Pharmaceuticals do not suddenly grow new mechanisms of action between phase 2 and phase 3 trials, but frontier models genuinely can pick up emergent capabilities between training runs.
Which suggests that whatever review framework eventually does get signed will need to be much more adaptive than a static 90-day pre-launch window. And that is a much harder regulatory engineering problem than people appreciate.
So our final thought for the audience is to keep watching this space carefully, because the next attempt to land an AI executive order is coming. And the shape of that next draft will tell us a lot.
It absolutely will, and we will be right here breaking it down for you the moment that draft surfaces, because this story is far from over no matter what the headlines suggested on Thursday afternoon.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.